All right, hello again, and this is lesson 3, and we're looking today at whose church is it anyway. And here's a quick overview again of where we stand on the semester. Next week we'll begin a second section, and this is the last lesson in deconstructing the modern church system. And here is the disclaimer. So, whose church is it really, is what we're talking about. And this lesson is looking at what are modern churches in America. And what most modern churches in America are incorporations. And recent surveys say that most churches in America have taken on an incorporation to the tune of about 80% to 90%. The numbers are in flux, but it's anywhere between 80 and 90% of all churches in America are incorporations. And so we want to look at what an incorporation is, or what an LLC is, a limited liability incorporation. So according to Black's Law Dictionary, which is the premier law dictionary in the land, it's been around for a very long time, a corporation is an artificial person or legal entity created by or under the authority of the laws of a state. It's an association of persons created by statute as a legal entity. So what that is it's an artificial entity that allows another party to sue it if something goes wrong. It allows you as an individual, or a group of individuals, or even a company or a business to act as an artificial person, so that if something legally goes wrong, it can act independent of that group of people. It's kind of like an umbrella. So we also can look at a Supreme Court case, which is Hale versus Henkel in 1906, and it defines also what a incorporation is. A corporation is a creature of the state. It is presumed to be incorporated for the benefit of the public. Notice, it's incorporated for the benefit of the public, not necessarily for your benefit. If you incorporate as a church, it's not necessarily for your benefit and the benefit of your congregation. It's for the benefit of the public. It receives certain special privileges and franchises which holds them subject to the laws of the state and the limitations of its charter. Now, this is extremely important, and if you don't come away with anything from today, you need to remember that. And if you even don't make it past this point in the video, if your church is a LLC, a limited liability corporation, if your church is incorporated, like one of our local churches is the First Baptist Church Incorporated, you need to understand that that holds them subject to the laws of the state, and they have limitations on what they are allowed to do. And that is according to the Supreme Court. So, in summary, a corporation and incorporated churches, they are a business. Their state is the creator, not the Lord. If your church is an incorporation, the state is your creator, not God. It has the state as the sole authority and its sovereign head. Now, these are not things that I'm making up. These are the laws of the land. And it is subject to the laws of the state, which does limit the rights and powers of that organization. Now, when I say the state is the sole authority and its sovereign head, You need to understand that this is all things that when a church decides to become an incorporation, this is all things that they sign on to. It's not something that they go into blind. They have to understand when they sign the dotted line that they are saying yes to all of these things because it's in the charter that they agree to. And it's in the state laws that they say, yes, we will obey this. They understand that the state is their sole authority. Now, maybe the members of your congregation do not understand this, but the people who design it, maybe the board of trustees, your pastor, your deacons, they know. So, we're going to ask this question. Does the government have the right to shut down the doors of the church? Now, we're going to get to that question. So, remembering that the corporation is a creature of the state and receives certain privileges and franchises which holds them subject to the laws of the land. And remember, the corporation being a creature of the state does not have constitutional rights. You heard that correct. Corporations do not have constitutional rights. According to Hale versus Hinkle, 1906, they do not have a Fourth Amendment right to refuse to submit its books and papers for an examination at suit of the state. So in other words, if your church is a corporation, you do not have as a church, as a corporation, as an LLC, the Fourth Amendment right to refuse the papers as an examination. So when the state says, hey, show us your books, show us you've been doing things right, you don't have a Fourth Amendment right to say, no, give me a warrant. No, it doesn't work that way. You have signed on the dotted line that you will do this. That is the reason why we have business meetings at church. That is the reason why your business meetings follow the Robert's Rules of Orders. That is the reason why at business meetings you have a secretary. Did you know that, or did you think that was just something y'all did? No, you do that because you have to, according to the laws of the state, because you're an incorporation. You don't do that because it's something nice so that you can have some nice history. You do that because that's the law. And if you don't do that, you're breaking the law. And you do that because every year you have to submit paperwork to the state. And if you don't, you're breaching what's called the veil of incorporation that we'll talk about in a little bit. I bet most of you didn't know that. I bet most of you thought you were calling a meeting to order and bringing yourself into a business meeting because you just thought that's the way it worked and that's a good way to run a church. No, you do that because you must. You do that because you will be out of order and you will be breaking the law of the state, which is your creator. And if you don't do that, you're violating the law and they can shut you down. So, let's be clear. Churches that are incorporated are legal businesses. So, your church is actually divided into two things. You have the ecclesia, the group of people, right? But you also have this thing called a business. Your church is a business. And that's just the bottom line. If you're an incorporated church, you're a business. Legal businesses have the state as its creator. The corporation is a privilege granted by the state. It's not a right. It's a privilege. They are subject to the laws of the state, which limits their rights and powers, and businesses have no constitutionally protected rights. So, and since they have no rights, the corporation does not have a free exercise of religion. You don't have freedom of speech. You don't have freedom of the press. You do have the right to peaceably assemble, but that can be taken away because you are under the laws of the state. You don't have the right to petition your government for the redress of grievances, and you do not have the Fifth Amendment right to protect yourself against the abuse of governmental authority. So, we want to talk about this thing called the corporate veil, and lawsuits and liabilities and personal assets. So, this thing called the corporate veil is something that protects board members and the corporation from liability. Okay? So it's kind of like a shield. and it's an insulation from corporate debts. And that's basically what the corporate veil is. So there's something called piercing the veil of the corporation. Okay? Piercing the veil of incorporation, or piercing the veil of the corporation. So what can do that? Absence or inaccuracy of corporate records, concealment or misrepresentation of its members, failure to maintain arm's length of relationships between related entities, failure to observe corporate formalities in terms of behavior and documentation, or intermingling assets of a corporation and the shareholder. Okay? We also can have a manipulation of assets or liabilities to concealment or the assets of liabilities. So there's non-functioning corporate officers or directors. I know of a church who has, and I'm not going to name the name, but if some of you are watching, they have someone on a board who has dementia. They have somebody as their legal representative who has dementia. They are non-functioning. But this is the person who they have as their officer for their LLC. It's on their state records in the state of Texas. Now, in the state of Texas, in order to have a quorum for a business meeting, that person must be present and cognizant for the business meeting. However, that can pierce the veil of incorporation. So ever since that person developed dementia, God bless him, I love this man, but ever since he developed dementia, they have pierced the veil of incorporation, and they have been out of compliance with their LLC. They have been breaking the law. And if the state of Texas wanted to, they could hold them subject to back taxes for the past 3 or 4 years and force them to pay penalties. And then so could the IRS with their 501c3. And what that would do is bankrupt that church. They could take all of their assets, their building, their transportation, their pews, everything. That's the danger that you get in. Now, significant undercapitalization of the business entity, siphoning off corporate funds by the dominant shareholders, that's fraud. Treatment of individual assets of the corporation for his or her own. So, here's another thing. If, let's say, the pastor decides he is going to, just one time, the pastor decides he's going to use the church van to go get a burger, that's piercing the veil of incorporation. And he's using the church van or the church vehicle to just go do something, go to Lowe's for his own personal use. That's piercing the veil of incorporation. Just one time personal use. One time. If it's not used by the corporation, but you use it for your own self. If you do it once, if you've done it one time in the history, you've pierced the veil. And if you've got somebody in your congregation, a larger congregation, that's a spy, and they've known you've done it, maybe they're just waiting. You've pierced the veil, and everything's in jeopardy. Okay? And then we've also got, was the corporation being used as a facade for personal use? And we know that this has happened. Now, there's another thing in here that can pierce the veil. What if you didn't have a quorum? So the state of Tennessee, where I reside, says that you have to have a quorum to have a business meeting. And if your rules and bylaws do not state what a quorum is, it has to be 10% of your membership. So in other words, if your rules and bylaws do not state that we must have 30 people or 20 people or 5% of our membership or 10% of our membership or 20 or whatever it is, if you conduct a business meeting, a called business meeting, it doesn't matter if it's impromptu or you give 2 weeks notice. If you conduct a business meeting and it does not have 10% of your membership, it is an illegal business meeting and you have pierced the veil of corporation and you can lose it all. And I have actually been party to, in a local church, of a called business meeting that had 7 people, and I know for a fact that it was not on their books, what a quorum is. And I know how many members the church has, and they needed at least 25 to 30 people, and they had 7. I was there. They breached the veil of incorporation. They breached the veil. And if I wanted to destroy the church, all I'd have to do is turn them into the Tennessee department that deals with this, and we could shut them down. That's how dangerous getting in bed with the state is. So does the government have the right to shut down the doors of the place where I worship that we call the church? You know, we hear this. Do you have the keys to the church? Well, who has the keys to the church? Jesus does. But no, we talk about the keys to the building. Do they have the right to shut the doors to the place where I worship? Yes, they do. And now I can just hear it. No, they don't. No, they can't. Yes, they can. Because the corporation is a creature of the state, and it receives certain special privileges and franchises which holds them subject to the laws of the state. This is what I said to remember. This is the law. The Supreme Court said this. So, the 501c3. We've talked about LLCs. Now we're going to talk about the 501c3 and the risk that is involved in being part of a 501c3. This is the man who brought about the 501c3. LBJ, it was called the Johnson Amendment, and what the Johnson Amendment basically did was kill your free speech. It killed your free speech in the church. But, unfortunately, people don't think it did. People think it gave them all this tax freedom, but it did not. Because churches that meet the requirement of Section 501c3 are automatically considered tax exempt, are not required to apply for and obtain recognition of tax exempt status from the IRS. Now, you need to know that I took this directly from an IRS tax guide. This is from a tax regulation document from the IRS. I didn't make this up. This is from the IRS. So, churches that meet the requirements of whether or not you are tax exempt, if you already meet those requirements, why would you go get a 501c3 and put yourself in the jeopardy that I'm about to show you? So, mandatory exceptions of subjects A and B, of subsections A and B, shall not apply to churches, their integrated auxiliaries, and conventions and associations of churches. You're already exempt from taxes according to the Constitution. Why would you apply for a 501c3? And when I show you this quote, I am not the only IRS employee who's wondered why churches go to the government and seek permission to be exempted from a tax they didn't know to begin with, and to seek a tax-deductible status that they've always had anyway. Many of us have marveled at how church leaders want to be regulated and controlled by an agency of the government that most Americans have prayed would just get out of their lives. Churches are in an amazingly unique position, but they don't seem to know or appreciate the implication of what it would mean to be free of government control. And here's why. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for the redress of grievances. You are already free to do all of these things. Why do you put a yoke on yourself? So, donors are allowed to claim a charitable deduction for donations to a church that meets Section 501c3 requirements, even though the church has neither sought nor received IRS recognition that is tax exempt. So, if you would donate to Agape Home Fellowship, please, I'm asking you, even though we have not sought 501c3 status and we are not incorporated, we are just a DBA, doing business as, you can still write it off on your taxes. This is all a lie. that you need to seek a 501c3. And I'm going to show you how dangerous this is and how almost every church out there has violated the 501c3 and what's going to happen. So, we have two questions so far. Whose church is it really? And can the government close the church, the doors of the church, not the spiritual church, but the physical church? So, we're going to review real quickly. What is the ecclesia? That's the assembly or the congregation. But we know that the word church, as we saw in our previous lessons, comes from an Old English word that is derived from a Greek word, and it means belonging to the Lord, and it meant a building. The word church means a building where people gather to worship. And in the Old English word and the Old Germanic word, it didn't necessarily mean to worship the Lord. It could actually mean to worship a pagan deity. It didn't necessarily have to mean people of God, the people of the Lord Jesus, worshiping in a building. It was actually used for Stonehenge, pagans worshiping. That's what the word church means. It is not the people of God coming together to worship. Church, in its etymology, means a house of worship, a place of worship, not a group of people coming together. Ecclesia is a group of people coming together, and assembly, a congregation. So, in ecclesiology, the church is a building, the ecclesia is a people. So, the two questions, whose church building is it really? The church building is the government's. And that church building does not belong to the congregation. It belongs to the government, because at least the building and all that is within it, because now all that property that belongs to the church in America, and I'm speaking mostly to Americans here, was bought with tax-exempt funds. And 90 to 95% of it was bought by a church that is either an LLC, a 501c3, or both. And it was bought with tax-exempt funds. And anytime you buy something with tax-exempt funds, there are strings attached. And they own that because of the tax-exempt status. And I'm going to explain how they own it. And there are certain privileges in exchange for that tax-exempt status. And if you violate that exchange, they can take it. And we're going to talk about that now. So, can the government close the church doors? Yes, they can, legally. Especially if the church is an LLC. Now, if the church is not an LLC, it gets a little bit trickier. But not one church building was built without a local permit. You didn't build your church building without an inspection in the United States. You didn't build your church building without being in compliance with the American with Disabilities Act, with fire code. You didn't build your church building in a vacuum. You didn't just say, okay, we're going to buy some land and put up a building and we're going to do it the way we want to do it. No, you did not. Now, you might have done that 100 years ago, but you didn't do it today. And I guarantee you, none of these mega churches with these pastors that are complaining, none of them did that. Okay? None of them did that. John MacArthur, who complained during COVID, he didn't build that building without the city coming in and running permits and saying, okay, your occupancy rating is this, and your electrical permits are this, and your sewage permits, and all of these other permits, and your parking permit, all of these permits. The government did that, and that's just the system in which we operate. So, the government, I want to say this very clearly, the government can persecute the church in America, and it won't even be against the standing laws. So, I'm going to say that again in a different way. The government can persecute the church in America, and it won't even be breaking the law. Let that sink in. All the government will need to do is enforce the current laws that are on the books that they have not been enforcing, and go back and make sure all the churches have been obeying the law that they swore that they would be in compliance with and promised that they would be in compliance with when they signed up for their LLC and their 501c3. So if your church signed up for an LLC and a 501c3 or both, have they been obeying the quorum rules? If you say that this is our trustee, or if this is the person that we're going to have as our signatory in the state of Texas as the head of our LLC, are they cognizantly aware? They have all their faculties? Have they been at every meeting? Because that's the rules in the state of Texas. They have to be at every business meeting in order for, or every person that's on the list. They have to be at every business meeting for you to have a quorum. Have they been there? If not, you violated your LLC. In the state of Tennessee, have you had a quorum? And they're going to look. Have you had a quorum? Have you been in obedience to all the rules? And as far as the 501c3, what's the violation? What is a violation? So a violation is something from someone in a position of leadership during what's called the look-back period. And this is called a disqualified person by the IRS. Someone in a position of leadership in the organization is called a disqualified person. And what they do is a disqualified person. In other words, there are people in the congregation that are qualified persons. They can say anything they want. They can do anything they want. They can wear any hat they want, any shirt they want. But if you're in a position of leadership, it means if you're recognized as a teacher, you're recognized as a deacon, you're recognized as a trustee, you're recognized as a pastor, you're in some sort of leadership position in the church, you're called a disqualified person. And also members of your family are disqualified people according to the IRS. Now, these are the things that you cannot do in positions of authority when acting as a position. Now, if you can do it in the hallway, but if you're acting in your position of authority, in other words, you're up at the pulpit, you're teaching a class, whether maybe it's at a lodge, maybe it's at your house, but you're doing a small group, maybe you're in public, maybe your church is putting on a function and you're in public. No matter how you're standing in a position of authority representing your church, you are not allowed to do these things. Okay. You can't give a statement that identifies one or more candidates for a given office. In other words, you say, I'm MAGA, or go Biden. I'm a Democrat, and a Democrat, so hey, I've been there. I've been at a church, and I left a church that I was working with because this pastor got up and said, he started campaigning. But I've also been at other churches who were Republican and started doing this. That is violating the 501c3. Whether the statement expresses approval or disapproval for one or more candidates' positions or actions. If you get up there and start slamming Joe Biden tomorrow, Sunday, you have violated the 501c3. If you get up there and start slamming Donald Trump because he is a candidate for president, you are violating the 501c3. If you get in there as a small group teacher and you start doing this, you violated the 501c3 for your church. Whether the statement is delivered close in time to the election. We're in campaign season. Whether the statement makes reference to voting or an election. Whether the issue addressed in the communication has been raised as an issue distinguishing candidates for a given office. Whether the communication is part of an ongoing series of communications by the organization on the same issue that are made independent of the timing of any election. In other words, it doesn't even matter if the election is close. And whether the timing of the communication and identification of the candidate, the non-electoral events such as a scheduled vote, a special legislation by an office holder who happens to be running for public office. You can see you have no wiggle room here. You now think back to all the times you have seen the 501c3 violated. Now, I'm going to show you something else. This is considered communication. Wearing one of these while acting at a function in your official capacity of your 501c3 organization as a pastor, a teacher, a deacon is a violation of the 501c3. Now, so what does the violation cost you? So what are the penalties? Something from someone in a position of leadership, this like again is called a disqualified person, or their families during the look back period. In other words, the IRS can go back a year, 2 years, 5 years and say, during this period, did somebody that's a disqualified person wear a Trump hat while they were teaching, while they were up on stage playing a guitar representing their church? They're called excise taxes. So let's say you're a deacon, and because I'm a conservative guy and I hang around a lot of conservative people and I know a lot of fans of Trump, I'm just going to use Trump. But like I said, I've also worked in inner city churches that are predominantly Democrat, so I could say the same thing for Biden. But we're going to go with Trump. Let's say, and I'm showing you the law. That list there that I just showed you, that came straight from the IRS. And if you're a 501c3, you agreed to that list. Don't complain, you agreed to it. When you took the 501c3, you signed on the dotted line and said, I will obey this. They didn't force you. I've already showed you the proof that said you didn't have to do it. You willingly signed it. So let's say you're up on stage and you're wearing a Trump hat, and you're a deacon or you're a teacher or you're just a band member, but your official function is a representative of the church, or you're teaching in a small group and you're wearing your Trump hat. Well, first of all, you're a disqualified person and you have a tax benefit because you've been writing, let's say, $5,000 a year off on your taxes, right? Well, now you owe back taxes. And let's say you've been wearing that Trump hat for 2 years, and they look back 2 years, and you've donated $10,000, and so you have claimed that on your taxes. Well, guess what? You now owe the penalty on $10,000 plus 25%, and you have 90 days to pay it. And if you do not come up at, and you can see it right there, within the taxable period, if the 25% tax is imposed and on the excess benefit transaction is not corrected within the taxable period, that's 90 days, an additional excise tax equal to 200% of the excess benefit is imposed. That's $40,000. So is it worth wearing your hat? $40,000. That's on you. And that's also on your board of trustees. Now, that's the individual. So repay the tax benefit plus 25% excise tax. It must be paid in 90 days. Otherwise, there's a 200% excise tax. If the organization are aware of the violation, in other words, they see you up there with your hat, they know you're wearing your hat, and hey, we've got freedom of speech, even though they know they're in violation because they're the ones that signed on the dotted line to obey the law. The organization, okay, is who is benefiting from the 501c3 benefit will be subject to all back taxes, including on all purchases during that period. They're now subject to all back taxes. So let's say the organization is, they were donated $200,000 for their church. Their church budget was $200,000. They were given $200,000. They are now subject to approximately $50,000 in back taxes. And then they will also be subject to excise taxes if they do not come up with that in a certain amount of time. So, persecution. If this ever happens, like I said, all the government has to do is enforce the law that you guys have been breaking. If this ever happens, many in America will scream persecution. But I want to tell you, we've done it to ourselves. Because 1 Peter 2:13 says, be subject for the Lord's sake, not for your sake, but for the Lord's sake, to every human institution. The IRS is a human institution. Romans 13:1 says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. The IRS is a governing authority. Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, Titus 3:1. Okay? And Jesus said this in Mark 12:17. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Okay? We will have done this to ourselves because we, the body of Christ, we made the promise, if we take the 501c3 and the LLCs, we made a promise to obey the rules in exchange for a benefit. We made the promise to obey the rules in exchange for tax-free benefits. And then we didn't obey the rules. We said, to heck with the rules. We're not going to obey those rules. Those are stupid rules. And instead, we took advantage of that benefit, and we used to take advantage of a worldly system and to spread a worldly solution by wearing our hats and speaking about political things. And we broke the pledge we made to the worldly system. And then, if enemies come and spy us out and call us out on our broken promises, so be it. We will have done it to ourselves. So if this ever happens, I don't want to hear any belly aching. I really don't. Because we would have done it to ourselves. And if this ever happens, I'm going to be spreading this video far and wide. Because the churches made a promise. They said, yes, please protect me from lawsuits. Give me an LLC. Please make it easy, so we don't have to prove ourselves. Give me this 501c3, and we promise we won't talk politics. And then they did. And then the government for years and decades didn't persecute anybody, or not even persecute. They didn't enforce the law. But then one day, maybe they will. And when they do, just enforce the law. Don't complain. It's like this. If the speed limit's 55 and you've been driving 75 and 80 down this road your entire life, and all of a sudden a cop pulls you over, what's your argument going to be? Well, I always drive 80 on this road. I can't believe you're pulling me over. Is that your argument? Or is your argument go, well, I've been driving 80 for 30 years on this road. I can't believe I finally got caught. This is the same thing, guys. It really is. So you need to understand that all the government has to do to persecute the church in America is enforce the laws currently on the books and to hold U.S. churches accountable for where they have violated those laws and promised to obey them, and they did not. So, that's the end of the day's lesson. There will be a quiz. I haven't come up with it yet, but I will in the next day or so. There will be a quiz on these first 3 lessons on deconstructing the modern church system. And what these first 3 lessons have been about is just really to show you what the modern church system, especially in America, looks like compared to what the early church looked like on what the apostles set up. And to show you how different it is. To show you how diametrically opposed they are. So if you have any questions and are seeking answers, I have a new email address. It is nelson@ahf-i.com. And I ask you to start sending all emails, tests, and everything to that email, nelson@ahf-i.com. And the scripture for the week is something I'd ask you to really meditate on. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Jesus is teaching here that there really are, there's God's kingdom and there's man's kingdom. We give to man's kingdom the things that are his, but we remember that God's got his own kingdom too. So next week we start another section where we actually are going to start looking at what biblical ecclesiology is. It's the functions and ordinances of the church is what we'll start looking at next week. So until then, may God richly bless you, my beloved.